Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the final installment of this Mike on the Mic week of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we are thrilled to welcome artist, cartoonist, writer Bob Fingerman to the program. Bob's been around doing his thing for more than 30 years. He has a new original graphic novel out called Printopia from Cosmic Lion Productions. Definitely want to get a hold of that. But we get into his whole career from coming up as a young cartoonist, trying to find gigs and then, putting together his original graphic novels and comics, including Minimum Wage, the one you may know him best from, but all kinds of working at, even Mad Magazine. And he also has another project called That's Some Business You're In, which is a graphic memoir that he put together that's still available on Zoop. So let's get into it. This is Bob Fingerman. And today we have cartoonist Bob Fingerman with us. Bob, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
We are excited to have you on the show, and we're going to kick you off with our number one first question, which is how did you first discover comics?
Okay, well, actually, probably partly to the chagrin of my father, who maybe wouldn't have necessarily chosen that path for me. My parents were divorced when I was very, very young, so I would spend weekends with my dad, part of the weekend with my dad, and that was at his apartment, and he had cartoon paperbacks. My mom didn't have that kind of thing, but nestled on in his bookshelves, which of course I would always just go digging through, because kids have a way of just ferreting out all the stuff that they're interested in. Um, just picking them out by spines, I found his Peanuts paperbacks, his Pogo, Lil Abner, some cartoon collections, including Playboy cartoons, which were probably a little spicier than they should have been for, I mean, we're talking, like a 4-year-old is when I really first saw the form and got excited by it. I think it's partly because, especially in the case of those particular cartoons, maybe not Lil Abner, but Pogo and Peanuts, and even Jules Pfeiffer. Jules Pfeiffer was the other one he had. Their styles were really accessible to young eyes, because in the case of Pfeiffer and Charles Schultz, they're very simple. So it was like I could look at that and process the visual information and understand it. The more complicated things are, the more realistic and painterly and all that, that's the stuff that you kind of have to build a visual vocabulary for. So instantly I responded when I saw those simple line drawings because I already had a predisposition to want to draw. But that kind of gave me, in a way, a realistic goal. It's like, I can understand that. I can try to emulate that. So
And did you start right from that young age trying to, like you said, emulate it, trying to maybe trace some things, doing your own strips, or did that come later?
yeah, doing strips came later, because I still didn't have any real sense of story or that kind of thing. The one thing I will never lay claim to being is any kind of prodigy. It was a process of just sort of chipping away at things until they began to make sense to me. But the desire was there. I'm not going to say that, I was not Mozart sitting writing sonatas at the age of 5 or things like that. It took a while, but yeah, it was always my goal. Once I really began to look at comic strips as something, because it also combined the two things I liked. I did like words almost as much as pictures. Eventually, I think it developed to be pretty equal, but I wanted to be able to tell stories and use pictures. And comics was just, yeah, the perfect synthesis of the two.
Did you? when did you know, or when did you think that you wanted to do this as some sort of profession or career?
Literally the moment I realized that was an option. It was one of those things where it's like, oh, the people doing these aren't just doing it for fun.
Right.
This is their job. Oh, yeah, okay, I'll have that, which is that's the kind of sureness that teachers hate from a child. Because, like, that you instantly become that kid who decides what he does or does not need to learn, so that's not what teachers like, because I was literally the argumentative little kid where when certain like things like algebra and calculus and so forth suddenly became part of the curriculum, I was definitely the kid who's like, I don't need to know this. And the teachers are always, well, you don't know that. Oh yeah, I know. I know. I do not need this. It's like all you're doing is cluttering my brain with stuff that I really don't. This is the kind of abstract stuff or that I cannot really process. It's like I know how my brain works.
Right.
I don't know what left brain and right brain is yet, but I at least know which I skew towards some things, not others.
Well, you were single-minded, whether right or left. You didn't know at that point.
Yeah, and I knew I was interested in word-based stuff because I had no problem with literature, and English assignments and all that kind of stuff. History, I was good with history. It's like, okay, I want to know some things. Uh, but yeah, that math stuff, it was the bane of every teacher. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Well, and then you, w again, I guess, as part of the course of this single-mindedness, you went to SVA, rather, School of Visual Arts, and presumably because for illustration purposes, right? And that's something you always wanted to do.
Well, yeah, I actually was lucky enough to go to an art high school as well. I went
Oh,
to the High
okay.
School of Art and Design in Manhattan. I grew up in Queens, but I started commuting to school in high school. And that definitely made a big difference because I always felt a little too much like the odd man out in my regular school. So to go to a school full of all the kids who felt like the sort of the nail that sticks out made a big difference just psychologically. You feel like, oh, okay, I kind of found my people.
Yeah.
Um, and then also, of course, having an art curriculum was huge. I finally could expunge that part of my rebellious personality of I don't need to know this, where it was like everything was I need to know this, which was pretty good, especially because at art and design, after 10th grade, you didn't have to take math at all anymore. You could just focus on art and writing and that was great. That made a huge difference. I
Yeah,
was
that must have been, like as you said, finding your people and really satisfying and gratifying in the high school experience, at least.
Oh yeah, I mean they even as one of the writing classes had comedy. That was the writing. It was a comedy class. It's like, okay, this works for me. Let me hone some of those skills. And that's the other thing that's nice about being able to pick something so specific at the high school level is if you have any aptitude for it, your teacher will definitely encourage you. It's like, oh, this one, he actually knows how to craft a joke. He knows how to do a setup and a punchline. It's like, so that was great. That was super helpful.
So you went on to, as I said, SVA, and coming out of that, it seems like you did a lot of illustration, not necessarily, well, I guess cartooning, but not on what we think of as, not on comic books necessarily, but within different periodicals and things like that. Um, what were you thinking about during that time period? Because you worked for many different kinds of publications, sort of a diversity of them. Was there one kind or one kind of material you liked the best, or how did you choose where you wanted to go, or is it just kind of assignments that you took?
Well, really, I mean, those are the days when, obviously, excuse me, we're talking well before the internet,
Yes.
when you had to have a schedule in mind of what days of the week certain magazines, art directors were looking at portfolios. It's like, okay, it's Tuesday. I can drop off my book at this, that, or the other thing. I can either go have lunch and, then pick up my book later, come back in tomorrow. And so it was a lot of basically just running around for pretty much anyone I thought my style would be appropriate for. There were certain publications I never would even bother because it's just like, yeah, I already know in advance they're not going to go for what I'm doing. Um, I mean, my hit rate for success with blind portfolio drops was probably in the 0 percentile. I mean, it might have been 1 or 2%, but that would have been a good year. It's really, it's like so many things. It was for me a business of referrals. I have a friend who's working for them, and if they weren't gatekeeping, because there's also, a lot of like, well, that's my gig. Don't try to horn in on my gig. But, I've always tried to be good about recommending people, and I've been pretty lucky with friends who do the same. And, that was really how it started, where it wasn't even necessarily publications I would have thought of, but I had friends working for them or a friend working for them who would say, yeah, let me hook you up. So like I did a bunch of illustration, for instance, for a magazine called Guitar World. I don't know if they would have even been on my radar, but I ended up doing a fair amount of illustrations for them. So really it was that kind of thing. Um, because yeah, anytime I tried to sort of punch above my weight class, it didn't usually yield any fruit. So yeah, it was. I mean, I look back at my career, and it's definitely a strange resume in terms of But when I say that, I mean before I started doing comics. Once I started focusing more on comics, it became a lot more. Um, it made more sense if
There
that
was a trajectory.
there was
Yeah.
and there was also kind of an aesthetic that was being established, but before that it was really scattershot. I mean, I started right out of the gate. My first regular work was for Cracked magazine, and that made sense because here I am. I just dropped out of SVA, but I had just worked for Harvey Kurtzman. Kurtzman gave me pretty good cred, to be able to say, okay, I just finished working for Kurtzman. Cracked uh, was also, I knew the editor somewhat socially. So, that became a regular gig. And that was a good gig for cutting your teeth, learning some skills, especially like in terms of doing likenesses and, caricature, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. Stuff that's served me well my whole career. But I will say, having a portfolio that was by and large tear sheets from Cracked does not get you gigs at the Wall Street Journal because they're just like, oh, okay, come back when you've come back when you've diversified a bit.
Yeah, not what we're looking for currently, but keep us in mind for later.
Exactly.
Um, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the transition because I think you broke into comics proper, if you want to even call it that, with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Um, did that was that did that just kind of come about during this sort of, journey of discovery almost, or looking around finding, all this diversity of stuff? Or was that a conscious like, I'm gonna get into, comics now, like let's see what I can find.
I'm sure the answer is a hybrid, because I definitely what it was I was doing the first solo comics that I released were all through the redheaded stepchild at Fantagraphics. They were doing adult comics under
Right.
the Eros Comix.
Eros. Yeah.
And so I released a bunch of titles through them, and I really didn't want to be known as just that guy, the guy who cranks out smut. That's not a particularly distinguished um, position to have in your industry. but somebody, and here's where it's one of those gaps in my memory, and I have not been able to fill in this gap. I actually just did a career retrospective book um, called That's Some Business You're In, and my memory is pretty good. But the one gap that really sticks out is I don't remember who brought me in to do Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I remember it was someone who liked my Eros stuff. So it was somebody who could see, in a way, see past the subject matter to the drawing ability.
Hmm.
It's definitely not like a linear progression to look at a porno comic and then say, that's the guy for Turtles. So, that was a lucky break, I would say. But boy, if that person, I'll say, say again, if that person's out there listening, please contact me and let me know so I can thank you all these years later. I know I was grateful then, but yeah, I can't remember who it was. And I feel bad about that because it was a pretty important step in the right direction. Um, so yeah, and doing Turtles was interesting because it did illustrate to me that wasn't the path I really wanted to take. I didn't really want to do, and I don't mean the Turtles specifically. I just mean
Hmm.
doing other people's IP. I've always been a person who wants to write and draw their own and create their own material. Um, but it was an excellent training ground. And it's not like I didn't enjoy doing it. It was like, okay, I've done that. That was a good thing to do. Now let me, get on with doing more personal type work.
Yeah, I can imagine even if it's not something you want to do, it's gives you a definitive, I don't know, decision or inflection point that you're saying, okay, didn't I tried that? That's not what I want to do, and now I'm more focused on what I really want, which is your
Yeah.
create our own stuff. And brings me to, your first graphic novel, which is White Like She,
Oh yeah.
which was I think just or I don't know, within the last few years reissued. Um,
Well, time is a weird way,
yeah,
especially in the COVID era or semi post-COVID era. Time is this weird way of becoming even more abstract. Because I was looking and that the reissue of that came out 10 years ago.
oh
But
boy.
it doesn't feel like 10 years ago. It feels much more recent somehow.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the first one. That was originally published by Dark Horse in 1993. So yeah, going back a way. Um,
Um, can you tell us a little bit about where the idea came from? Was it something you were kind of hanging around to, you had in your back pocket, or was it something that sort of came to you post Turtles when you were looking for your next project?
well, actually, it was pre-Turtles by a good number of years because I had originally done a short story for Heavy Metal Magazine in I think maybe 1988 called Double Uh-Oh. And it really is the genesis of White Like She. It was only, I think, an 8-page story, but all the setup was there of brain swapping and all these kinds of things that ended up getting fleshed out for White Like She. I did two installments for heavy metal. The first was Double O, and then I think the second one was just called Girl Trouble, which was a bit longer. I think that one might have been like 14 or 16 pages. And at first, when I was just thinking of doing a longer form thing, because at that point I was working for Dark Horse, doing a lot of short stuff and some covers, and they were definitely receptive to me pitching something of my own. And I thought, well, what do I have that's kind of ready to go? And I heavily retouched. This was the old days again when the pre-digital, when I would get out my jar of liquid paper and just slap it over old artwork and redraw on top of it. And I thought, well, let me bring this art up to speed. And I ended up heavily reworking those two heavy metal stories and then realized, no, I need to start over from scratch. But it was enough for the pitch for them to say, yeah, let's do this as a 4-issue mini series. And Yeah, it's funny what constitutes failure then would be considered a mega hit now. Because I think if I'm pretty sure I'm remembering right, uh, those issues sold, maybe the first issue sold about 15,000, then the others maybe about 10,000, which in those days was so low that Dark Horse said, yeah, we're not going to collect it as a trade paperback. And these days, if you're selling 10,000, you're at the top of the sort of the top of the heap, especially for indie comics. So
Yeah.
it was a different world 31 years ago.
Yeah, the 90s I think skewed a lot of numbers back then because, that's when I started getting to comics and it felt like a golden age. There was so much material out there and everything was selling the indie stuff and yeah, now it's been the market in general has been kind of atomized. Well, entertainment or literature in general, I think, in the same way. It's like you can have there are just so many different things vying for attention that it's yeah, the numbers are just in a different range than they used to be.
Yeah, and I don't know what years the black and white boom. I know that was a thing for a while where there were tons of black and white titles. It was not considered peculiar. I think a black
Yes.
book now would probably be looked at as fairly exotic. I know there still are some, but since color printing and color seps and all that have become pretty much same price as black and white, nobody bothers with doing black and white anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which in a way is
I,
a shame. Black and white has its own sort of power.
I agree. I think it may be it almost feels like the color went hand in hand with the paper stock and production values, and so it almost made it because I feel like black and white works on a different kind of paper stock or production than it does, because once you get it so glossy and shiny and detail oriented, the black and white sort of doesn't go as well. I wish they would just kind of package up the black and white in a different package. I think it would still do well. I mean, it still does well in things like manga.
Hmm.
And so I think there's definitely a, market for it. But yeah, you're right. It's mostly now feels like holdovers from things that started black and white rather than new projects that way.
Yeah. But like, picture in your mind if Love and Rockets was color. I don't think it would in a way have the same it wouldn't have the same effect on the reader. There's
Yes,
something especially about Jaime's work where it's so balanced,
right.
just as black and white. I think if you added color to it, it would actually diminish some of the effect. So anyway, that's a whole other that's getting
Yeah,
to a
that's a
nostalgia.
tangent, but I agree with you. I think also probably the artist's intention counts for a lot, right? If they know they're doing it in black and white, I think um, again, I don't know, I'm not the artist, but they work towards that aesthetic that is brings out the best in a black and white versus if they're working in color, that's maybe a different approach. Anyway, back to where we were at after White Like She, you is this the right word? Sort of retreated maybe from science fiction, from sort of those fictional worlds, and started Minimum Wage, which was more, I guess, real life, semi-autobiographical. Um, was this a case of, okay, I feel like established, I've gotten my first stuff out there, I'm just gonna write what I know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry if you hear my dogs in the background.
No.
Um, yeah, yeah, I mean, in a way, minimum wage was sort of a palliative after White Like She, because White Like She. The other thing is, I drew it in a very different style than I'd ever drawn anything before. It was almost 100% photo reference, and I had friends and people model for all the characters, and it really it took all the spontaneity out of art, and I thought I wanted to do something frankly a little bit looser and more cartoony. I know for some people cartoony is a pejorative, but for me it's a good thing. And it really was just like, okay, I know what I want to do visually, but what do I want to do in terms of storytelling? And I'd never really mined my own life for material before. And it just felt like the right time to do it. But even there, I hedged a little bit. That's where the semi before autobiographical comes in, because I didn't want to just do pure autobiography. For one thing, then even though I was not very good at covering my tracks in terms of portraying real people in my life in a fictional way, at least I could always say they're not exactly real people. Um, but also it gives you the opportunity to kind of fudge things and not stick to a strict chronology. That's where editing as a storyteller came in, where it's like, okay, well, that's a good story and that's a good one. And, sure, they happen 6 years apart, but I can make them happen contiguously. And so, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it was a good decision because of anything I've done, that's the thing I stuck with the longest. And that's the only thing I even came back to years after sort of putting it on hold. Uh, and who knows? I always say it's possible that minimum wage could come back someday. I don't necessarily think that's true, but I wouldn't say no either. I don't like to definitively say no to any possibilities.
Sure. Um, well, after minimum wage or in between, I guess, shall we say, bouts of minimum wage, and there may be
Sure.
more after this. Um, you continue kind of diversifying your subject matter, and also you diversified sort of the medium because you broke into prose
Hmm.
as well, some prose projects. Um, what would you was minimum wage kind of do you feel like had discovered like your, I guess, confidence and your what you wanted to do and therefore felt better about whatever was coming after that? Was that like I said before, kind of an inflection point for you in your career?
Yeah, well, I think I began to feel definitely more confident in the writing. The writing was always something I enjoyed doing, and I think even there, like, because of course it goes hand in hand with my personality, that self-criticism is a big part of my mental wiring. Like even in minimum wage, where I think the writing definitely took a leap forward. I mean, I haven't sat down and reread that in years, but I know it's wordier than it needed to be. I think that was partly because A, I enjoy writing dialogue, and B, I always felt like when people buy a comic, if they read it in 5 or 10 minutes, they're not getting their money's worth. So I was like, I'm going to make it so people really get their money's worth. Um, I have anyone who's familiar with my work knows I have a sort of nasty habit of every time I get a reissue of something of mine, I go back in and rework it. I I share that George Lucas DNA of going back in and futzing with things. Um, so like if I ever, I mean, one of the projects that I would love to do, and I might even try to get it going in the next year or so, would be to do a definitive minimum wage and collect all of it. Phase one, which would be the Fantagraphics years, and then phase two, which would be when I brought it back with Image, and put it out as a nice big 500 plus page book. I know I would go back in and do some rewriting on that because it's like, do I really need 100 words in that balloon? I bet I could say that in 50. And it's just, I think there are ways you could make it read cleaner. Um,
Yeah. So it definitely sounds like George Lucas, except somewhat the opposite side of the coin. So instead of, adding extraneous detail and special effects, you're trying to minimize.
yes, yeah, less is more, I think, at a certain point. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's also certain chunks I would just cut out of it, and it's like, well, that was self-indulgent. I don't really need that in there. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of that.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll see. We'll see if that project happens. I think people would actually be happy to have it all between two covers, sort of
Oh, for sure.
a author's cut. Can't say director's cut, but
Right. Special edition, what have you.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah. I mean, not that you want to, jump on a bandwagon or trend or anything, but those big omnibus formats are all the rage now.
yeah,
So people just like having everything at their all in one between two covers, like you said. I wanted to get back to the comics versus prose. I know it's not really a competition, but you seem to have balanced both in your career. Do you like hopping back and forth, and what do you find the advantages are to one versus the other?
yeah. I would love to. That's the thing. Writing novels did stem from hitting a wall with comics. Like after I had finished the first run of minimum wage, I really was at a kind of a juncture where I thought, do I want to just do more comics? And I definitely needed to just sort of do a reset. And I'd always intended to do novels. And so I just kind of put comics on hold for a while. I wrote a novel, a first novel that never got published, but it was a good way to, at least it landed me a literary agent and, kind of got that phase of my career going. Um, but yeah, as I say, I mean, I consider the words definitely as important as the pictures. And just like with movies, movies really only as good as its script. You can have all the beautiful visuals in the world, but if the story and script aren't good, you're just going to say, well, okay, it was nice to look at, but it was a pretty empty experience. And so for me, skewing more towards just the verbal side and not the visual side was something I definitely wanted to play with because they're ways of writing visually. And so that to me was an interesting challenge where, you don't go overboard. There's this thing about if you have too much description, you get bogged down and all that kind of thing. I don't think it's very fun for a reader when you've got a 2.5 page description of a location. Who cares? We don't need that much detail. But I mean, I would love to write more novels. That's the thing is there's just when you get into the weeds of talking about the actual industries, they both have their pluses and their minuses,
Mm.
and the last actual novel that came out was speaking of going back in and doing the George Lucas thing, in was it 2022? Heavy Metal, they were toying with getting into the prose game. And so I re-released my second novel through them, a book called Pariah. But I did heavy reworking. Probably 40% of it is reworked. So that was kind of a nice way to um, sort of rectify things in that book that I had had 10 years to, uh, you know, fret about.
Right.
I could have done this better. There also was more of a sense of this is the thing where again you hope as a person you and as a creator you mature and in a way I wanted to add a little bit more of a sense of humanity to the book because it's a pretty dark book and even in a book like that, or I should say, especially in a book like that, I wanted to have sort of more empathy for what was going on. Um, so that's a book that's gone through multiple iterations. The first unpublished, which was so dark that that nobody would touch it. Then the one that did get published, and now the new one, which is still pretty dark, but I think it's a more satisfying read. So, but that made me definitely it re-whetted my appetite for writing just prose. So I'd love to do that again.
Aptly named book, Pariah, and both for, the subject matter and for, the bleakness of the first draft. I
Oh,
guess.
oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, definitely to every editor it was submitted to the first time, it lived up to it. I remember getting a very nice rejection from an editor, and she loved it, but she brought it to, I guess, the rest of the editors in her department, and they read it, and I believe the word was repugnant. So she's like, the other people in the department found the book repugnant, and I was like, wow, that's a strong word.
That is a strong word. Boy, yeah. I guess you have to have thick skin for to be in any creative endeavor, but yeah,
Yeah,
specifically, I think
exactly.
writing. Uh, One thing I noticed, and Pariah fits into this, is that you've had a lot of work that includes zombies and post-apocalyptic settings and things of that nature, horror. Um, what appeals to you about that particular genre, if I could lump it all into one genre?
Yeah, that's probably a bigger, deeper psychological issue than I'm
Take a
even.
seat on my couch,
Yeah,
close your
please,
eyes, and tell me about
please get your little notepad out, and we'll.
it.
It all began. Um, okay, so now it gets really into the psychological nitty-gritty. I will say I was more. I'm still quite enamored of post-apocalyptic entertainment, but I was way more enamored of it in the phase of my life that I now refer to as New York Bob. I lived in New York my whole life up until 2017, and then I moved to Los Angeles. And so there's that bifurcation of the New York Bob and then California Bob. And California Bob is working towards being a much more cheerful person. But in New York, I did embrace the darkness. There's a reason why it came through, especially in a couple of the novels. Um, and so, what's darker than thinking about the apocalypse? The only thing is, I did find humor in it. Um, that's where you strike this kind of balance between because I never did anything like The Road. I'm not Cormac McCarthy. I'm not just like, oh, everything is
Right.
horrible. It's just bleak, bleak, bleak. I
Yeah.
mean, the one book that I did that was set during post-apocalypse was a comedy, and there's something inherently optimistic in a way about post-apocalyptic things because they really are just about people getting on with their lives, just in a very altered circumstance. But the thing is, the apocalypse that I embrace is the wacky apocalypse. I like it with mutants. I like it with, I
Sure.
don't just want people coughing their lungs out because they're riddled with cancer. That's not the apocalypse that I choose to embrace. So, I'm actually going to be starting a new comic project, and one of the things I want to do in it are sort of short, humorous, post-apocalyptic vignettes. So I'm definitely not out of those woods yet. There's still stuff I want to do there. But yeah, the idea of it just being unrelentingly realistic, zero interest. Um, and yeah, I mean, the zombies are a different kind of apocalypse. It's not radioactive, but it is pretty much doom and gloom. And even there, you kind of hit a wall
Hmm.
with how many variations on a theme can you do? And eventually it's going to become repetitive.
Right.
Um, Speaking of reworking things, it's the theme of this episode is reworking things. I'm reworking one of my graphic novels right now, a book called Recess Pieces, which was little kids and zombies, and I'm in the process of bringing it up to speed and completely redoing the ending. Um, but again, that's a comedy, so it feels very different.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's a fertile playground. I mean, the soil might be irradiated, but it's still fertile. So I don't know. I enjoy it. I mean, one of my favorite graphic novels of all time was Richard Corbin and Jan Stranad's Mutant World. That one
Hmm.
really, really just. was everything I look for in a graphic novel. It's like, oh, I like these characters. The artwork's incredible. It's so um
Well, I can say that you're not alone. I mean, I enjoy zombie and post-apocalyptic literature, if you will, both comedic and in some cases bleak and dark, and my wife wants none of it, but I'm like, I love it. And yeah, we can probably do a whole, psychological episode about why that is. But I do find that it is, like you say, sort of fertile ground, and there are just it, those circumstances bring out a lot about what you can write about humanity in general and the human
mhm.
condition. Um, and so I always find that, fertile, dramatic ground. But let's hop to LA, Bob, and you getting to work for Mad Magazine.
Oh, yeah, that was definitely a lifelong dream, having been a mad kid. Um, and for a while there, I wasn't sure it would even ever get to be a reality because there was a while, I mean, it evaporated a long time ago, but there was a while where if you had worked for Cracked in the years I worked for Cracked, you were
Hmm.
kind of persona non grata at Mad. Um, but there's there to go with the radioactive terminology. The half-life on that was fortunately not one that lasted the rest of my actual life. Um, yeah, the opportunity to work for Mad actually came up earlier than my working for them years ago when Dave Berg passed away.
Hmm.
Um, I had been offered the opportunity to at least try out to take over the lighter side. And
Yeah,
I didn't think I was a good fit for the material. And B, I didn't really want to be the new Dave Berg. It just kind of felt, it just didn't, I didn't want to step into his shoes.
right.
So it's not that I said no, I just didn't pursue it. But it did kind of live in my head for years like, boy, I turned down the opportunity to possibly be one of the usual gang of idiots. And so, about, I don't know if it was a decade or a little more than a decade later, um, when they were in the process of retooling the whole thing to for the Burbank move, um, a friend of mine, very fine artist in his own right, Bill Morrison, was hired by Mad to be their executive editor. And I sent him an email of congratulations, just saying, hey, it's so cool that you got the gig. Couldn't be a better fit. And, I said, and if there's any room for me, let me know. And he wrote me back and he said, you're already on my list, which was obviously great and very flattering. And we got together uh, and he offered me the lighter side. And I just was like, how is this happening twice? What is it about my work that makes me seem like the Dave Berg of the 21st century? Am I the cranky old man? Get you hippies. I didn't think that's the way I came across. Um, but at any rate, that time I thought, okay, I'm not going to let opportunity slip away twice, so I'll just try to do it. And I started writing up premises for Lighter Side, and none of it felt right. It still didn't feel right. Partly because the humor in that was really always very much like a daily comic strip where it was set up, gag, set up, punchline.
Yeah.
And that's not really the kind of thing that I necessarily focus on. So he was in town. This was still in New York. This was right at the end of my tenure as a New Yorker, and we went out to dinner. And I was very nervous because it was actually right around. It was he was in town for Comic Con, New York Comic Con, and we went out to dinner at a French place in my neighborhood. And I realized I could be screwing myself out of a gig. But I said to him, Bill, I just don't think I'm the right fit for lighter side. Um, and he said, "Oh, that's fine." And then he told me about the new section of the magazine that he was planning, which was going to be for the first time in Mad's history, a section of the magazine devoted to character-driven stuff as opposed to topical humor and all that. So he said, "Would you be interested in that?" I was like, "Yeah, that's what I do." It's like that is my wheelhouse. So it ended up becoming a very celebratory dinner. And so I came up with a pitch and they bought it. And uh yeah, that was it was interesting because that section of the magazine um really what it was, and I was told this right at the onset, was, Warner, Mad was a very expensive magazine to produce. It had the highest page rates of anything that, DC was publishing. And because of it all being topical humor, there was no, to use an industry term, exploitable IP because there was nothing. So that section of the magazine was basically being looked at as kind of an in-house incubator for IP. They could either do as animation or, streaming entertainment, hence it being character-driven stuff. So there was very much an eye towards, will this make a good show? Which is
Mhm.
definitely not something, Mad contributors ever really had to consider. But my brain kind of works that way anyway. I mean, I've always thought pretty much everything I've done would make a good show, or movie or whatever. So I came up with a strip called Boonies, Burbs, and Bergs, which was about three tweens, country cousin, city cousin, suburban cousin, who all don't really like each other, and they keep getting lumped together, dropped off by their parents in these various scenarios. And I thought this could go forever because I can satirize every aspect of life by just dumping these kids. Their sort of negligent parents can keep dropping them off in
Right.
in these scenarios. And for whatever reason, the powers that be decided after three episodes that it was not what they were looking for. I guess they did not see a series in it. I disagree, but so I panicked for like half an hour and then thought, okay, let me pitch something else. And I'd actually had an older pitch that I dusted off and they bought it, which in the history of the magazine at least stands out as unique in that it was the only serialized strip that ever ran in Mad. And I thought, I've outwitted them because it's every chapter will be to be continued. So it
Right.
can run forever. But unfortunately, it only ran four chapters. And then again, um, fate had different things in mind. So I did always want to at least wrap that one up. I felt a little bad that it just ended on this open note. But that was a strip called Lukey and Mukey, which was a lot of fun. I think that one could have gone
Yeah.
for years, but at least I got to do it. So, I have nothing but uh, feelings of satisfaction that I got to be in Mad. I got to do some stuff that very much felt like my kind of humor. Um,
Right.
maybe in a more all ages. My stuff usually skews it more for adults, but I got to do uh, some stuff that even had a little bit. I wish this one strip wasn't, if not more relevant now than when I did it 6 years ago. But one of the, I think it was the second episode of the Boonies, Burbs, and Bergs, where the kids get dropped off with Nazi white supremacist relatives, and yeah, here we are. That strip is more more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
But the less we say about that, the better. But it was supposed to be topical humor.
Yep. Well, you hit that bullseye.
Yeah,
Or the bullseye came to you in subsequent years.
yeah.
Um, So let's get to your most recent work. With two of your most recent work. One you've referred to already, which was that's some business you're in, which is kind
Hmm.
of I don't know, half, or I'm going to do more than one half or more than two halves, half art book, half maybe memoir. I don't know what maybe a third half would be, graphic memoir, I guess. Why, when you were putting that project together, why did you think it was the right time to kind of take this look back at your career? And is it still available for people to get on I know you were crowdfunding it.
Yes, yes, well, to go and to answer the first part of your question, this year, 2024, was kind of, it's all sort of arbitrary, the importance we put on certain
Dates. Yeah.
milestones. But there were two pretty big life events that were staring me right down the barrel this year, which were I was going to turn 60, which I still can't quite wrap my head around. Um, and it represented my 40th anniversary working as a professional. And so I
Okay.
thought, okay, those are two pretty big things. Um, what can I do to sort of celebrate it and also take some of the sting out of it a little bit. Um, and I thought, well, this seems like a good excuse to do kind of a career retrospective to date. I didn't want to wait for 50 years because who knows what's going to be going on in another 10 years from now. But yeah, it just seemed like a nice round number. And also, while my memory, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles memory gap notwithstanding, my memory's still pretty good. So I figured, let me write this thing now while it's not completely me just sitting there saying, "Wait, what happened? Oh, I think I know what happened." Um, and yeah, just do a nice big hardcover, you know, book with tons of art and really right, it's not a it's not a personal memoir. Like I say, it's a career memoir. I mean,
Right.
the thing is, when you are what you do, it's very, the personal and professional are very enmeshed. um so there's definitely a personal quality to it. But yeah, just to write about all the phases of my career to date, um share a lot of anecdotes. It was an interesting project, and I definitely wanted it, again, speaking of words, I wanted it to be a good read. You know, I don't find art books that are just art without anything to contextualize it to be as engaging. Like, I like
Yeah.
to kind of know some stuff. If it's a monograph about an artist and he's dead, give me some biographical things,
Right.
give me all that stuff. Because just a bunch of pictures, it's fine, it's nice, but to me, it's not, it, it doesn't connect as much. So I wanted a book that people could really connect with, um, and feel they kind of know, would get to know what it was like. Like, when I say in the pre-digital era, a lot of people don't really know what it was like to pursue an art career before you could have a website, or before you could just hit send or say, check out my Insta. It was definitely a more tactile, more visceral, slightly more feral industry in many ways. So yeah, it just seemed like the right time to do it.
I think also, based on the title of the book, I would expect that there's some reflection on, just like you said, the industry, the business, and how it's changed via, how your work or how things in your career or life has sort of proceeded, but the business has also changed immeasurably over
Yeah.
that span of time. Um, what would you say, if you were to give if you only had one thing, what was the biggest change you've seen over your career within the business itself? I guess the business of comics and maybe comics publishing.
Wow, that's an interesting question.
I'm
You
sure there are a lot of them, yeah, which we can make a second episode of. But
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it is an industry that behaves pretty much the way it always did, but in a way, they're sort of like micro adjustments that end up becoming bigger things. I mean, it's still kind of the way it used to be, where if you have an idea, you send in a written pitch and it either sinks or it swims. Um, Certainly, just I mean, these are the kind of things that aren't necessarily funner or I don't, well, hopefully they're still interesting. I mean, the numbers have all changed over the years.
Mhm.
What constitutes, like I said earlier, what constitutes a hit now versus then. I don't know if anything sells like a million copies anymore, but that used to be a regular thing. And, it
Yeah,
wasn't even just because of the sort of grotesque period of pre-bagged and,
yeah,
Mylar variant covers and all that. I mean, there was a time when comics sold well over a million copies just to people who wanted to read them.
right.
That is definitely not the world we live in anymore. So, it's an industry where I think on the one hand, there's probably more creative voices than ever, which is a great thing. You see a lot more kinds of material, and that's 99.9% courtesy of the small press.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there there's a tendency, especially for people my age, maybe slightly younger and slightly older, to sort of tinge everything with a hint of bitterness. And I don't think that's healthy. I don't really see that being a very helpful way to live. Because what's it going to do? It's just going to make you miserable. Um, it's probably in some ways a little tougher than it used to be. It's certainly tougher to make a living because numbers drop. It's like anything else. If the numbers drop and it's sort of let's
Yeah,
call it a low profit industry. Sometimes it's just a break even industry. And obviously a lot of the time it's an at a loss industry. So, hopefully you find your tier and it's not the at a loss part. But for me, I still love doing it. And so, you adjust to the challenges. Like page rates, for instance, are actually lower in most cases than they used to be.
right.
Obviously, that's not great if cost of living goes up and your compensation goes down. And I apologize, listeners who are finding this part a little too in the weeds. But these are the things that creators do have to be aware of. Um, so, but I mean, I'm still doing work that I take real personal satisfaction in. So, and I know that's a luxury. So I don't want to complain. It's like, is it harder to sell a book now? Is it harder to promote? Or do you have to have more skin in the game to promote things? Those are all things that are different now. There used to be, in a way, more of how would I put it? More of a mechanism for promotion of things because it's just the way it
Mhm.
was. It's like
Yeah,
I am with a publisher. The publisher will put ads in this and that. They will hopefully set up little bits of press or here and there.
right.
It's a much more hands-on now, where it's like, okay, and this again goes back to that early part of the conversation about referrals, getting your career going because a friend said, hey, my buddy, he's also pretty good. Maybe you should take a look. You and I are talking because I think our buddy Dean Haspiel uh,
Yeah,
put us together. So
right.
that's that's where we're at now, where it's like, okay, there's this cool podcast. Maybe you should talk to so and so, or, hey, you have a podcast. Maybe you should talk to this artist. He's got a new book out. These are things that are definitely different. I'm sorry, this is also me thinking out loud, answering your question as it's like a little pachinko ball bouncing
Yeah.
around until it finds the hole. And I think it found the hole finally. Um, so that's very different,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a bad thing. This is again, this is where uh there are pluses too, because this is nice. Here's you and I are having a nice conversation, and it's a kind of connection that didn't used to happen.
Yes.
In
Yeah.
a lot of ways, it was more um abstract. Who's out there? Who am I talking to, and what's
Right.
going on? And so I don't know. The Brits have that phrase, swings and roundabouts. It's all swings and roundabouts. There's some things that are less good than there used to be. There's some things that are better than they used to be. Um, and again, I'm doing work that I care about.
Yeah.
So that's a plus.
That's great. It's I think the answer would be different for every single person, even though we're talking about one industry. One thing I've heard a lot, and mostly from people that are have just gotten in or have just started their own thing, is that the barrier for entry is lower, which is good for people that are coming in. Um, but to your point, it does create then some, more obviously, if the barrier for entry is lower, then you have more people there, then it's just sort of competition for eyeballs. And like we had talked about, it just becomes the whole market becomes sort of atomized and becomes very small. But then you get, like you said, conversations like this, and there's less mediation between readers and creators. So there's good and bad. I think just like any industry or anything that changes over time. But hopefully the good outweighs the bad.
Yeah, and
Let's
I
go
probably
ahead.
I was just because I hope I have a few more years before I get put into the dinosaur category. And I think I've still got probably a little bit more relevance in the tank
Oh, for sure.
before I finally qualify to do the lighter sides. Like
There you go.
kids. So
The lighter side will come for us all, but you have a little more time. Speaking of which, you have a new graphic novel out, so there's definitely a lot more in the tank. It's called Printopia. Um, it's from Cosmic Lions Productions. Is that right?
that is right. Cosmic Lion Productions. Yeah, they're a pretty new publisher. They've been around a few years.
Yeah.
Uh, and
I think I'm gonna interview Eli, the publisher or the
oh yeah,
president, at some point later on. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, where the story came from, what it's about, and how did you get Matt Groening to do a blurb?
okay. All right. Let me see if I can remember all of those. I
Oh,
mean,
you can answer them in whatever
the,
order or not answer some of them, whatever.
yeah, the genesis of the book actually goes back pretty far. I mean, it was a book that I began when I was still in New York. Um, and actually, it's kind of funny because it started off as a prose book. It was going to be prose with illustrations, and the whole Printopia part of it was not in mind at all because Printopia is the name of a print shop in the book, which is where the main character Darla works behind the counter. I mean, basically, the book is it's kind of a combination of classic workplace comedy
Hmm.
because you've got Darla, her coworker Augie, and their boss Billy, who work at this print shop. And then you also have Darla's personal life with she and her roommate Candy. And that's the framing device for all these vignettes throughout the book, which are these sort of extrapolations of what are the lives of the customers of Printopia like. And the customers are all these eccentric, kind of oddball creatives who are coming in there. I mean, basically, it's vanity press, it's small press, vanity press, people self-publishing,
Right.
these people who feel very, very driven to put their ideas out in the world, but in the traditional in-print um, way of doing things. So you've got all these characters, and then you've got not just the creative oddballs, but all of them have their muses. Because I wanted to come up with this way for how can you basically portray characters pretty much having a conversation with themselves. You don't want to just draw people thinking. That would be
Yeah.
very dull. So they all have these little kind of cartoon um, their muse, if it were, that they have these conversations with, where they really get to explore where their heads are at, why they're doing what they're doing, their insecurities, their all that stuff. Um, and on the other side, you have Darla, who wants to be a creative, but she's wrestling with her own imposter syndrome and lack of self-confidence. And so there's a lot of stuff in the book. Um, I mean, in a way, the book is very different than anything I've ever done before. Certainly visually it is, because there's every chapter, all the parts about the different creators are kind of done in different visual motifs. Um, but it's also in a way a little bit of a return to form, because I was going more and more towards um, fantasy and things like that. The previous book I did was a book called Dottie's Inferno, which were all humor stories set in hell. And I wanted to get kind of grounded again, but grounded in a way that still gave me permission to do really weird little scenarios. I'm not going to do the spoiler of all of these different depictions of the characters, but I think it all comes together in a nice there's a nice bow tied around it at the end of the book. Um, I think that was your question. I have a tendency to give a somewhat rambling answer and hope that
No.
I addressed your question.
Well,
Um,
I have a tendency to give very multi-part questions that you have to start to remember what they were a part of. No, that gives a really good idea for what the book's about and how it's kind of laid out, which is um, in one way traditional in terms of the subject matter, workplace comedy, but also very non-traditional in the way you're representing, these thoughts and little daydreams, maybe if you want to call them that. So I think that's great. And my jokey question was, how did you get Matt Groening to do a blurb for the
oh,
book? Are you friends with him?
uh, well, I mean, we've kind of sort of bumped into each other over the years, mainly at like Comic-Con. He he liked minimum wage. I mean, that was, but here's I guess this is the strange thing. We basically reestablished contact. Uh, was it this year? Or, no, I guess it would have been earlier this year at a memorial service. We were both at the same memorial service, and we just got into a kind of a nice conversation. Um, and ended up kind of being more in touch. So, and then I figured, well, I do have this new book coming out, and it's always a little weird when you ask someone for a blurb, because it obviously it's the very definition of self-serving. Um, but again, that's the industry. You
Yeah.
got to sometimes do these things, and there's ways of doing it, I think, gracefully and graciously, and then there are ways that just seem entirely opportunistic. But it felt organic, because I already knew he liked my work, and I said, "Hey, I've got a new book. Would you give it a look?" And he said, "Of course, I would love to." And then I thought, okay, well, that's part one. I said, "Well, if you like it, maybe you could give me a blurb." And he said, "Sure." So anyway, We
That's
went
cool.
out we went out to lunch and yeah, whatever it was, week or two later, he sends me a wonderful blurb. So there you go. Uh,
Super.
very nice man, I will say. He for somebody who literally whose work has impacted every corner of the globe. I am sure Bart Simpson, there's probably, maybe in some of those tribes that are still left untouched by humanity in New Guinea, maybe they don't know who the Simpsons are, but probably that's about it. So for somebody, I mean, there aren't a lot of people in the world who've had the kind of impact his work has. Yes, a stunningly nice human being. So yeah.
Great. Well, I'm glad that kind of all came together for you and for Printopia. The book is currently published, right? It's on
Yeah,
Cosmic Lion's website. Is that
yeah.
the place to go?
Yeah, I believe it actually hits the stores on Wednesday, the 20th. So, but it's all already available for order directly from Cosmic Lion Productions. In fact, they even have some signed copies and sketched copies available through them directly, but also through Amazon. So it's hopefully readily available to anyone
Mhm.
out there. And I think just as a sidebar, I don't know if you've actually seen the physical book. But I
I
am so
haven't.
happy with this book. This was one of these things where I had some things in mind of just production value,
Yeah.
and I wanted it to be an oversized book. The people listening won't be able to see this, but it's a really um,
Oh, that's cool.
big hardcover, and it just printed so nice. These are the things that put a smile on a creator's face, where sometimes it's like, oh, this just is the thing I wanted it to be, you know? Sometimes it's a compromise. It's like, well, it's a little smaller. This one is exactly what I'd hoped, and believe me, that's worth its weight in gold. So very, very happy with it.
Good. Good. Yeah, I can't wait to get my hands on the printed copy. I've only seen a PDF, which I very much enjoyed. Um, so in closing, other than Printopia, which is a huge undertaking, and glad it's going to be out by the time this episode drops, out in time for the holiday season. Go get your gift
Oh,
copies for everybody in your life.
it makes a great gift. I won't say it makes a great stocking stuffer. You'd need really big feet, but
Yeah, no kidding.
it's definitely a good gift. And actually, just one other thing I'll mention about it, because it really was, sometimes it's the peripheral things you do that are so much fun. One of the things about the character Darla is and this is something I knew from people who've worked in copy shops. When weird stuff comes along, they usually make copies for themselves. It's just the way it is, folks. You think maybe that's not happening, but when somebody comes in and it's like, oh boy, this is something, they make copies for themselves. And there's a section at the back of the book which is her dossier of samples of all of the characters' work, and that was so much fun to do because
Oh
it was an
yeah.
opportunity to draw in different styles and kind of write in different voices. And because one of the characters in the book writes cozy mysteries, and one does basically an epic fantasy fanzine kind of thing. And so there are all these different samples of the different characters' work, and I think uh, that section probably will maybe get the best laughs from people who read the book, because I think there's some pretty good stuff in there, if I do say so myself.
I always love that kind of stuff where yeah, you get into sort of the different, it's almost like a sort of a meta look at different comics, right?
Yeah.
From the different characters. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not certainly not going to put myself in the same breath as Alan Moore, but that was something I always enjoyed when he would have those, like in especially in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you would get these little dossiers of publications
Right.
from the era and this and
Yeah.
that. I'm sure that's the stuff a lot of people skip over because it's like, oof, too many words. But and by the way, I'm sure I didn't read all of them, but that stuff I love because it's just like, oh, it's this extra window into that world.
Yeah.
So if it's a world that you're enjoying, why not take a deeper dip? So anyway, this is sort of my attempt at that kind of thing.
Okay, we're back. Love talking to Bob. A lot to dig into there. He's had an amazing career and it continues with Printopia. So go to Cosmic Line Productions. I believe it's probably out in all fine book and comic stores. So go check out Printopia and go check out That's Some Business You're In, which is his graphic memoir. Also, I think currently on Zoop. So go check that out. And Bob, thanks for being on the program. Thank you all out there for listening, for viewing, for rating, reviewing, subscribing. I hate to harp on it, but it really helps. If you can do that for us, we will count you among the very best and most spectacular supporters we have. We really appreciate it. We have a whole new week of episodes coming up next week, so we'll see you then.